Good morning, YouTube, from sunny Auckland. It's allegedly winter here, but turns out winter in northern New Zealand has a slightly different meaning than what I'm used to. Today I'm going to do a very quick video on the anatomy of a baitcaster. And I'm doing this because I switched over from spinning reels to baitcasters 5 or 6 years ago and absolutely love them. And although spinning reels are far easier to use, I just wouldn't go back now. Once you develop the skills to use these, they are so much more robust than a spinning reel. The accuracy of my casting is now much improved. The distance of my casting, I mean, add half again, at least. They're just great bits of kit, but there's a learning curve to them. So I thought I'd go through it. So let's start with this one. This is a Daiwa CG80 carbon graphite 80 baitcaster. It's in left-hand wind because I buy all of my reels in left-hand wind. If you don't know, a standard baitcaster is actually right-hand wind, where a standard spinning reel is left-hand wind. But because I spent so many years using spinning reels and only winding left-hand and only holding the rod in my right hand, I just find it easier to buy these in left-hand and keep them in left-hand. So, parts of the reel. Casting drag. That controls these little magnets in here and the proximity of the little magnets to the spool. That's the spool. Probably shouldn't have done that because it'll be a bugger to get back in there. The one and entire purpose of those magnets, of that particular form of drag, is to prevent birds nesting on casting. Very good for newbies to keep that set to some extent. I tend to keep it set very light, and I'll explain why in a minute. Next part, star drag. That is exactly the same as the frontal reel drag or rear drag on your spinning reel. That literally just sets the resistance to the line being pulled off the spool. So that is just, the tighter that is, the harder it is to pull that off the spool. That is all that does. That's about fighting the fish. And actually the drag works in exactly the same way. If you open one of these up, it's the same friction washers against steel washers, and it's about the tension against them. So that, it's important to know, that only affects the drag of the line being pulled off. It doesn't affect the spool in any other way. It's actually not directly connected to the spool. Unlike that is your spool tension. The spool tension sits literally pressed up against the axle of the spool. And that is designed to give you a basic level of tension that's always going to be on your spool, no matter what you do. Now a lot of people are very fussy about spool drag, and you'll hear all sorts of nonsense about how to set that properly, about put the lure you're using on the lure clip and then hold the rod up and then just set your spool drag with your lure in free spool until you just about start to drop, and it's blah bollocks. Absolute nonsense. All that needs to do is to stop this from moving laterally, side to side. Okay, so if you set that really loose, which I'll do now just to show you, loosen it off, that will be loose and rattly. Can you see the movement in the spool versus the chassis of the reel? And what you want to do is just very gradually tighten that up until you feel all of the lateral movement is gone. And then if you put the reel in free spool, that should still feel really free. You're not, if you get that set right, you're not looking to impinge on the movement of the reel in terms of its spooling at all. It's just about keeping the reel true and seated properly within the chassis. If you don't do that, you are going to be in bird's nest central every time you cast. You can set that tighter if your casting is really awful or you're just learning. Personally, I wouldn't set the mags to number 9 if you're that worried about your casting. If you're a newbie and your casting is something that you're just getting on top of. spool tension, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is just should be about preventing the lateral movement of the spool in the chassis to prevent birds' nests. People overuse them, in my opinion, of course. Next part is an obvious one. It's a level wind. So that's line runs through that, and as you wind it on, it lays it evenly across the spool. I tend not to worry about that too much. If you are a newbie, it is worth setting it when you cast so that it's in the middle, and so that the line is coming off the middle of the spool. So what you don't want is your level wind set all the way over here and your line coming off all the way over here, because then the line's going that way before it goes that way, and then that can cause you bird's nest if you don't know what you're doing. It's easier to address that problem before it occurs. This is your free spool knob. So at the moment, my spool will only spool off. It won't spool on, sorry, when I wind. Otherwise, it won't do anything. I can spool it backwards manually, and you see that affects the wind on. That's as if I'm winding it on. It's doing the same thing. That disengages the mechanism, and now my spool will free spool forwards, backwards, forwards. That's what you're doing when you're casting, essentially. And then as soon as you take up the tension, it clicks out of free spool, and you can't free spool it anymore. In terms of how to use one of these, a friend of mine who ironically doesn't really use them gave me the best advice that I've had when I started using these, which is always have your thumb very lightly in contact with the reel. So when you're holding the rod, you've got your trigger grip there usually, and your thumb just very lightly on the reel. You're not interfering with that at all. So you're casting, it's not a snatching motion like you might do with a spinning reel. You get away with that with a spinning reel. You won't get away with that with this. This should be a very smooth, not a sudden, not a wind up. It's a very smooth motion with a very definite abrupt stop. Keep your thumb on the reel, because what you'll feel if it starts to bird's nest, the first thing that will happen is the line will start to come loose on the reel, and you'll feel it, and you can just give it a little dab with your thumb and that will stop it. Same thing as you casting, watch the lure. As soon as the lure hits the water, the instant the lure hits the water, just give it a little dab of brake, just a boop, and that will stop it. Bird's nesting. I use these with almost no casting drag at all. I say there's no tension on my spool tensioner at all. That does not provide any drag on my spool. It merely prevents my spools from moving laterally left or right. That is all I use that for. Again, other people like a bit of drag on it, but you know, frankly, I think they're objectively wrong. These are about practice. The best advice I can give you is buy some cheap braid. Don't put expensive braid on these until you're very good with them. I very rarely get bird's nests, but every now and again I will go and I will try a new type of braid on one of these, and it will be an absolute mess. I'm not going to, but I could name stiffer brands of braid that I would never ever put on these, because having tried them, they're a nightmare for bird's nesting, and that's someone who's been using these for 5 or 6 years, and actually I'm pretty good with one of these. I can belt a cast out with one of these, and I don't get bird's nests very often. So yeah, I do recommend you braid though, because they tend to have a small spool and you want to get a decent amount of line on, and braid's just objectively better. I'm sorry, but if you prefer mono over braid, you're just objectively wrong. There's no, you know, I can't even be bothered to argue it. Braid is better. That's it. I hope you will think about giving one of these a try. As I say, that's your Daiwa CG80 if you fancy one of these. They're not expensive as reels go, but they are extremely good. So have a go.